good evening. Welcome to all tuning in from around the world. My name is Tina Moni. I'm a senior advisor here at the IOE, the International Organization of Employers. We represent the voice of more than 50 million companies around the world, and I will be your moderator at this Spotlight event. Before we start, on behalf of the IOE, I would like to thank UNCTAD and the ILO, who are the co-leads of this timely event. I say timely because by now you would have already known or have come to know that micro, small, and medium enterprises, the MSMEs, have been bearing the brunt of this storm, this pandemic. Certain sectors are also more hard hit than others. Let me just highlight some of the statistics. 9 out of 10 workers in the developing economies work in the private sector. 90% of companies are made up of SMEs, and SMEs contribute to at least 50% of the global economy. SMEs create jobs. Just by sheer logic, it would make sense for policymakers to take their views into account in economic recovery related policies in efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. It would be amiss of policymakers to ignore the challenges small businesses face. Policies cannot work without their inputs. Policies cannot work without having a conversation with the national employer and business organizations. Employer and business organizations also represent the voice of small businesses, not just large ones. I can go on, but let us introduce the discussion with a short video of an entrepreneur who can explain a little bit better than I can. IOE has been interviewing what we call business heroes, entrepreneurs and business owners from all over the world to talk about their struggles, their challenges, ways in which they've adapted during the pandemic. These stories showcase the resilience, the drive, the innovation that SMEs need in order to survive in a difficult environment and illustrate the human story behind running a business and how sometimes they also need help. Now let's go to Peru.
Cuando Pixet nace, quien les habla tenía como fundador 25 años y era una empresa que estaba desarrollando tecnología, prótesis biónicas. La credibilidad que tuvo que ganar Pixet fue uno de los caminos más duros, sobre todo en un país donde la innovación y el desarrollo tecnológico no estaba tan consolidado. El financiamiento, los fondos que están al alcance de empresas como Pixet son relativamente limitados. Hemos tenido que hacer recorte de personal. Cuando comenzamos la pandemia empezamos con un equipo de 12 personas. Ahora somos un equipo de 3 personas que tratamos de seguir logrando el cambio que Pixet busca. Las prioridades económicas de todos han cambiado. Y quizás si una prótesis era una prioridad antes, ahora la prioridad es poder tener que comer en el día a día o dónde vivir en el día a día. Entonces, nosotros entendemos, pero también como empresa ha sido duro pasar por todo esto. La bancarrota es algo que preocupa, que muchas veces quita el sueño y que sobre todo lo que más duele pensar de eso es que la bancarrota también se llevaría el propósito de Pixet con ella. El propósito de Pixet no puede parar. Y si para eso nosotros tenemos que dar la milla extra, como se dice, nosotros estaremos ahí porque nosotros creemos verdaderamente en que se puede dar un cambio sistémico hacia una inclusión verdadera hacia las personas con discapacidad. En estos momentos difíciles es muy importante recordar por qué empezamos con algo, cuál es ese propósito por el que empezamos. Libertad financiera, tranquilidad laboral, sea cual sea el propósito, no hay ningún propósito malo para un emprendedor, pero siempre hay que recordarlo, sobre todo en los momentos difíciles, porque recordar ese propósito va a hacer que sigamos y que la resiliencia propia de un emprendedor se active.
Welcome back. Now, to set the scene, I would like to invite the speakers here today to make some opening remarks outlining the main messages they would like to convey with regards to the theme, Building Back Better from the Bottom Up, Collaboration with Micro, Small, Medium Enterprises for SDG Implementation. May I first briefly introduce Dr. Chanteline Carpentier, Chief of UNCTAD New York office. Dr. Chanteline has extensive experience working in the UN system, having worked at UNDP, UNDESA, Division for Sustainable Development, and has wide expertise in food security, sustainable development, sustainable agriculture rather, trade and ethical investing, among others. She is also author of various books and publications. Dr. Chanteline, may I kindly invite you to say a few words with regards to the theme. Over to you.
Thank you. And Tina, let me start with the good news, is that the crisis not only exposed and deepened pre-existing fragilities, it elevated the role of entrepreneurship and MSMEs in achieving socioeconomic development, including the SDGs and policy circles. And this was absent from the response to previous financial crisis. EMSMEs are now a priority for member states, the UN, and others, as everybody on this panel recognize. As you mentioned, because they are key to providing job and being the backbone of our economies. During the pandemic, they not only leveraged digital technologies to adapt their manner of working and survive, they helped communities by providing services through e-commerce, online payment, delivery of goods when supply chains were disrupted, and did so when the more traditional company faced major difficulty. However, the COVID-19 crisis has reminded us that crises do not impact all of us the same way. For developing countries, the devastating impact of the pandemic is likely to be felt by a few years to come, while some advanced economies that had the fiscal space to support their enterprises are expected to fare better next year than if the pandemic had not occurred at all. This number, Tina, maybe make the point clear. 10% of the stimulus spending has reached 70% of the world population living in developing countries, 10% only. The pandemic is also affecting smaller companies more, as documented by the global ITC COVID-19 Business Impact Survey, finding that though virtually all companies are affected by the pandemic, nearly 2/3 of MSMEs report strong impact of their business compared with less than half for large companies. And of course, if you look at women, youth, ethnic minority, migrant, they suffered the most. To overcome this two-speed recovery that we're witnessing, we will require that all of us rethink our policy to ensure they lead to a recovery that is people-centered and planet-friendly. And for that, we need the voice of the MSMEs and the entrepreneurs at the table. And to address these asymmetries, and also in the capacity for them to respond to the pandemic between the MSMEs and larger companies, most MSMEs, for instance, may need to change their business model, accelerate innovation, and better response to new customer habits and increasing the natural disasters. But also new businesses will emerge out of opportunity, including business opportunity related to achieving the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. This transformative vision requires closer and stronger collaboration between all actors in support of entrepreneurs and MSMEs. And beyond the emergency measure put in place by most governments, the pandemic provides us with a chance to adapt our work to facilitate the emergence of growth-oriented and innovative, purpose-driven enterprises as part of integrated industrial, trade, science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship policy, as opposed to the way we've done it in the past in silos. I think I'm going to stop here, Tina, and then listen to other panelists and then keep the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Chanteline. That's already gave us hints, and I'm sure by now there are a lot of questions coming in already from in the chat. Thank you for that. And for now, let me briefly introduce Ms. Patricia Verenga-Gesquez, business owner and renowned entrepreneur from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ms. Patricia is founder and CEO of the Job Factor Recruitment in the Democratic Republic of Congo. After 15 years of professional experience in various fields in the Netherlands, Belgium, and South Africa, she moved back to open her business. In 2015, she was also appointed the president of the National Social Commission. In fact, we showed your video, Patricia, today, sorry, as an entrepreneur during one of the ECOSOC side events on changing landscape by breaking down silos. So without further ado, Ms. Patricia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina. And thank you, everybody. Hello, everybody. And well, I'm actually very honored. I'm very pleased, you know, when I hear Chantal speaking, and it's actually very impressive. And, you know, Tina, how we collaborate. And I read Farid as we were preparing this. So I'm very honored to be amongst all of you. And yes, SMEs, I am part of the SMEs world. And indeed, the struggle's been real. The struggle's really been real. And I'm actually very sorry that the LDC meeting or gathering couldn't go on. And I can't wait for it to be, you know, to be organized, because indeed we have things to say. And I would actually here speak about, I'm fairly optimistic about everything. I like to see it that way, you know, and because it keeps me going and it keeps me creative. And I'd like to talk about challenges that we've actually faced as SMEs, and I would mostly say from a regulatory point of view. There's been, even IOE has been doing really a great job, I must say, during all this pandemics and confinements by sending lots of guides, etc. It was extremely important because, you know, we're going to go to talk to government as EBMO because I represent employers organization. I'm in the head of the organization, and we'll go to government, but it was even easier to go with certain texts that I already made. So that was, I can't thank you enough, IOE and ILO and partner, okay? But we really face challenges from a regulatory point of view. Just to give a little example, today we keep on speaking about teleworking, you know, we all do it eventually. How is that regulated? I think I'm going to speak from an African point of view. In most of our countries, there's no particular regulation. There are here and there some text, but not. But since the pandemic has hit, then what has happened in the meantime? Not much, you see. For instance, in the DRC, we've had cases here. Can we imagine that when you have a insurance, because now we have, it's been, the market's been open, we've got different type of insurance company. But can we imagine that if something happens from a COVID point of view, it is not covered? And though here, we already take charge of every single thing that has to do with medicals. All the medical that needs to be paid is paid by SMEs. That is how the law functions. Now think of it. We have people that we have to pay because, well, it happened. I mean, it's not no one's fault. We have to pay. In case of particular disease, it's still on us, we SMEs, right? And up until today, and I can say because I do work with my colleagues in Africa, not much has happened from that point of view. So what do we do? To end up on a bit of a positive note, I would say that what I've seen that was very, well, let's say positive in all this pandemic moment was the fact that we've been actually, I would almost say we've kind of leapfrog in the digital area. That is something that's happened. Suddenly we've leapfrogged there. So, but I think we're going to further discuss with Tina. Am I in the time, Tina? Am I good?
Yeah, you're good. You're perfect. Thank you, Patricia.
Yeah,
Excellent.
okay.
And we'll go deep dive into those shortly in the last segment.
Okay.
So now, thank you very much. Okay. And I would like to now introduce Dr. Farid Higazi. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Farid worked at the ILO office in Egypt and has at least 20 years of experience working in development to help sustainable enterprises, especially SMEs. Dr. Farid has worked in Southeast Asia, the Balkans, Europe, Latin America, the Arab states, and Africa. Very impressive. May I now kindly invite Dr. Farid for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Tina. It's an honor to be here with all of you with such an esteemed panel. Both our moderator as well as the two other speakers have already alluded to the importance of SMEs in general. I will try to shed light specifically on SMEs in Africa, as this is the region where I currently serve, with a focus how the current pandemic has affected SMEs in Africa. And what are some of the policy responses that we think are needed to build back better. Although I talk about Africa, but similar fates have hit SMEs in other regions. What I might be talking about has relevance in other regions to other extents as well. So what we know is that the negative effect of COVID-19 to the world economy is estimated about $12 trillion by 2021. In Africa, the pandemic has led to negative growth of minus 5.1%. So this is the biggest and the worst recession in 25 years of the continent. We also know that the pandemic had disparate impacts on SME dominant sectors, especially in tourism, trade, and services. SMEs that employ between 70 and 90% of the population of Africa, the effect of COVID-19 pandemic has been even more severe. 87% of business owners were uncertain about the future of their businesses. Like my colleague said, women-led MSMEs have been especially hard hit, with many of them reporting revenue losses of over 50%. The biggest challenge that businesses' survival were associated with was inadequate financial support, which was also mentioned by the two speakers, lack of government support. There were measures taken, but in many cases they were lacking and they were not reached everyone, and numerous measures meant to curb COVID-19, such as the lockdowns. Just to elaborate, a recent survey by UNDP, African Union, AfriLab revealed that there were major challenges faced by businesses due to the pandemic. 90% of African SMEs reported their business was heavily impacted by the pandemic, and 95% testified they never got or received any government support to combat the economic downturn. The few respondents who benefited from government aid received amounts totaling $40 to $50 in local currency. You can think about how much that can help you. And the pandemic is likely to increase the previously estimated $421 billion financing gaps for SMEs. So it was already there before the crisis, and it's going to be even worse with the crisis. All African governments have taken immediate fiscal and monetary policy measures to mitigate the adverse effect of COVID-19 on SMEs, whether it was availing direct funding, whether it was encouraging moratoriums on debt payments, whether it was providing temporary tax reliefs or credit guarantees. So in addition to these immediate policy measures being undertaken in response to COVID-19, governments should also consider mid to long-term structural policies for African SMEs to enhance their resilience after the crisis, like our entrepreneur from Congo just told us. Recommendations should include strengthening the awareness of opportunities for SMEs, investing in skills and capacities, speeding up the adoption of digital technologies, as the other speaker also mentions, development of new business models, and reshaping and redefining customer bases and strengthening credit institutions. What we know, and that's maybe my only positive note, because all my colleagues talked about positive things, is that women-led MSMEs are actually using digital tools at a slightly higher rate than male-led MSMEs, and they are expressing thus a greater need also for financial services for customer base expansion and new product development. That was the part about government. The last 30 seconds I want to spend about things that are important for employer and business membership organizations. As the previous speaker already stated, many employer and business membership organizations are being severely affected by COVID crisis themselves in terms of the service delivery that they can offer, the membership, and their own income. Nevertheless, they are making great efforts to respond effectively to the crisis as the representative voice of business and engaging and supporting their members for business continuity. Also, EBMOs are implementing various measures to minimize the negative impacts of COVID-19 on their own organization, but also on the SME landscape by advocacy and so on. And I could go on forever, but I can see my time being finished here, so I'll gladly interact with you later on. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Farid. We cannot emphasize enough the important role of EBMOs in the recovery process because they really take into account and support small businesses in the ground. Thank you all for your contributions. I am sure by now the listeners already have some questions in mind. I see there are at least 194 people attending on this platform and a lot more on Zoom. So I'm sure by now you have some questions. Please do not hesitate to include your questions in the chat and the Q&A if you have any, and we will address some of them at the end of the session, time permitting. Thank you. Before turning back to our speakers, let's hear from another business hero about their experiences and how they've grappled with disruptions. This time, let's fly from Peru and go to Uganda.
I wasn't supported by government. It was entirely a private move. And however, I had tried writing proposals, but they did not yield anything. So at the end of the day, I thought about private execution. So entirely, there was no government support. Venturing into lab work is quite capital intensive. Purchasing the lab equipment wasn't easy. So what I did, after thinking through my future plan, I started acquiring the lab equipment one by one. Usually the beginning is tough, and that is when most of us get off. Because as we face challenges, usually we tend to give up. The pandemic really affected us at BioCoa, and you find that most of the businesses suddenly had to close offices. We noticed that sanitizer was a cash cow. We also became distributors of the product at the time. So in a way, this kept us in business. We had to rethink about the business model. Besides doing lab work, besides doing environmental impact assessment, besides doing environmental audits, we had to think about something that would actually keep the business moving at that time.
Welcome back again. Let us now change the order of speakers. I would like to invite Dr. Farid now to talk a bit about the ILO support to SME promotion. Dr. Farid, thank you very much for your opening remarks. You talked about, Africa being, in the worst recession, and indeed the videos confirm that, what you said, a lot of these entrepreneurs, they do not receive support from government. So I would like to ask you if you could tell us a little bit more about your work on developing policies for SMEs, especially specifically on ILO's work in this space. We understand your work in Egypt, for instance, is said to be a really turnkey support. Can you share with us some of the best practices and the lessons learned?
Sure, thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Tina. I would like to share with you specifically country example of Egypt, and it's not directly linked to pandemic because this has been going on for maybe a sphere of 4 or 5 years, because this change requires a lot of time. And but we did support, extend some turnkey support, as you said, to the SME sphere. I'm going to call it sphere because it's not just policy, because we were supporting several flanks of the issue, both on a policy level, but also on an institutional level. And I'll talk about all of these in the next 4 to 5 minutes as you have granted. So in terms of developing SME policy, that's the first step that was done. We were looking at a fully bottom-up approach by which this policy was developed. We conducted a large national survey to establish the needs of the SMEs themselves. That's very important. And it was mentioned also by the speaker before. If you want to talk about SMEs, you need to know what their issues are, what the problems are. And that's this fully bottom-up approach that we followed. And then we had a huge and very wide stakeholder consultations, which included the different government ministries that are engaged. It's not just Ministry of Commerce, but it also has to do with taxes. So you have Ministry of Finance, has to do with manpower issues, and so on and so forth. Usually you have 5 or 10 ministries that are of direct relevance to SMEs that you have to talk to, and other government agencies. You have to talk to about development partners about their programs. You have to talk to the financial system, to banks, because as you know, access to finance is one of the largest issues that SMEs usually face. And then we had this agreement on a vision and a mission, because this is very important. To be able to stand behind the policy, you have to have a vision and a mission, and I'll talk about it specifically in a second. Then we developed the different pillars that are needed for such a policy, then the different programs, and then very important, how to translate a policy into action planning and budgeting, because it's very nice to have a policy, but a policy without a budget is not even worth the paper that is written on. Now, the vision for Egypt, after a long discussion, became entrepreneurs formulate business ideas and have the drive and skills to develop and launch them into sustainable enterprises, contributing to the socio-economic development of Egypt. So this is really a big encompassing one. And then a mission that translates this. I don't want to go into too much detail. And then the 5 big pillars were legal and regulatory environment, as my colleague from Congo just referred to, the importance of this one, access to finance as a standalone pillar, entrepreneurship policies is another pillar that is very important. And then the 4th pillar was export and integration into value chains / supply chains. And the 5th pillar was on business development services. And then of course, the cross-cutting themes of gender, environment, and technology that are very important. I just want to at least highlight the importance of having also a monitoring mechanism for such a policy. Now, that was the first part of the puzzle. The second part was actually advising the government in how to set up or to transform an existing organization into an MSME organization. We were engaged in classical organizational development advisory. We were kind of the McKinseys of the developing world on this work, trying to tell them how to set it up, what governance model to follow at the top, who needs to be president, what are the qualifications of the president, what are the board of directors, how do you include the required qualifications, how do you get the private sector represented on these boards? That's very important to be able to get this done. Then you asked me about some lessons learned. I mean, one of the biggest lessons learned about this exercises is that the setup of an SME promotion agency through which all government supports to the sector is channeled is more efficient than spreading the resources over various support organizations, as is done in some countries. You can use an indirect approach to administer programs. That means you implement programs yourself, but you contract third parties to provide services. So you're kind of a facilitator of services. This is also another one, because no government agency has the capacity and the mindset actually to be able to provide these services for the SMEs. It needs to be done through third parties as service providers. Of course, it's very important to include stakeholders and other public and private sector parties. This improves your legitimacy and the relevance of the agency. And lastly, you have to have a stable funding mechanism that is key to the long-term effectiveness of the agency. Maybe lastly, there's more lessons learned, but this one is important, I think, is to become a learning institution, and that you adapt your interventions to new needs, which is of course very, very important now in the context of a pandemic such as COVID, where the things are changing at such a fast pace that if you're not a learning organization, you cannot keep up, and you start yourself digging your grave into organization that is no longer relevant. Lastly, and that's the second part and the counterpart to a government institutional side, is creating an SME unit at the Federation of Egyptian Industries. The Federation of the Egyptian Industries is the national employer organization, partner of the ILO and member of the IOE here in Egypt, and how to create an SME unit inside to counterpart what you said, Tina, in your opening remarks, to say these organizations also represent and specifically represent SMEs, not just the big bosses of the companies and the large companies that are there. But specifically, they need to have services that they can offer to SMEs that are not the normal advocacy things, because they need to have very specific things. And we introduced two of these very concrete tools, and I'll only talk about them for the next 27 seconds, which I have, which is to an SME test. An SME test is something by which the unit looks at any kind of amended regulation or new regulation that comes out and looks at whether this would potentially have a negative impact on SMEs and how they can minimize this negative impact by, for instance, changing the timing of the regulation or allowing for more time for it to be implemented and all this, to try to reduce the burden of this new regulation on SMEs. And the other one is a specific business barometer for industrial SMEs to keep the checks and balance with government, tell them how business owners, SME owners feel and perceive the business environment, whether it remains the same, whether it has become better, whether the government efforts such as and the discovered financial handouts, whether they actually work or not, or whether it's perceived that they don't reach the final beneficiaries. I don't want to take much more of the time. This is, I think now, according to my stopwatch, 5 minutes. So I'll stop it right here.
Very efficient. Thank you, Dr. Farid. You're helping me do my work as moderator. Thank you so much. And it's true what you say, the regulatory environment on SMEs needs to be really conducive. And all the tools that you mentioned, the SME tests, the barometers, all these tools are important. And especially what I found interesting about your intervention was you mentioned that it should be sector specific. I think that's really important rather than a holistic approach when it comes to this, because there are some sectors that are more hard hit than others. For instance, tourism, you know, that's a common one. So we need to also help these EBMOs, the employee organizations, as you mentioned, to have this specific SME unit within, because then they would have the expertise to also support the SMEs on the ground. And I think that's where I think the ILO's help, the UN's help would be really, really key. Thank you very much for that. Now I would like to invite Dr. Chanteline to come in and provide an overview of UNCTAD's work on enterprise development, and more specifically on how it assists governments and policymakers on one hand and SMEs on the other. In this respect, can you tell us specifically about UNCTAD's entrepreneurship policy framework and UNCTAD's ImProtect program? From your perspective, what is the role of innovation policies, which you mentioned earlier in your remarks, and the public measures to spur digitization and addressing common SME challenges? So over to you, Dr. Chanteline.
Not in 5 minutes, right? Well, I'll try to be as efficient as my colleague Farid. And by the way, I agree with everything he said. As you said, UNCTAD support entrepreneurship through our entrepreneurship policy framework, as well as through our ImProtect program. One is directed at policymakers, and one is directed directly at entrepreneurs. And so what we do through that is basically help member country achieve target under SDG 4 on quality education and SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, along with our sister agency, ITC, ILO, IOE, and others. And since the pandemic, Tina, UNCTAD, along with the Regional Economic Commission and the other UN entities, have contributed to the UN socioeconomic response to COVID-19 through a program to enhance MSMEs online and offline market access, to strengthen capacity of MSMEs and entrepreneurs to respond to the crisis, and competition policies in the post-pandemic world. I mentioned the level of support that developed countries receive versus developing nations. And so that creates competitive issues, competitiveness issues that we're addressing through this program. And then we're in the process of implementing this project, and outcome will be presented shortly. And then to support a bit of what Farid was mentioning, so the entrepreneurship policy framework has 5 components. Of course, it's helping member states put in place entrepreneurship, national entrepreneurship policies. But as he said, what we're trying to do is to create a strong entrepreneurship ecosystem. And for that, what we need is the other pieces, which are the enhancing the education and the skills, facilitating technology exchange and innovation, access to financing, we can focus that enough, and raising awareness and networking amongst our entrepreneurs. So moving along to the Protect program, which started in Argentina in 1988. It's now been installed at the request of countries in 40 countries, initially in Latin America and Africa, but now throughout all continent. And we count 500,000 entrepreneurs that have been trained and call themselves entrepreneurs. And what it is these centers in countries, but also it's a 6-day training workshop that help participants discover, recognize, and apply a set of 10 entrepreneurial competencies and 30 associated behavior that lead to better performance in and more resilience to external shock when applied. So this is something that we've done, and what we found is that we needed to adapt the entrepreneurship policy framework to different audience. So with the Commonwealth, we've developed the entrepreneurship policy guidance for youth entrepreneurs, and also with our colleagues in migration for refugees and migrants. And interestingly, the policy guide for young entrepreneurs has been among one of the UNCTAD most downloaded publication. Because of course, one thing that's different between the youth and other entrepreneurs, they don't have the collateral, right? And they may have less network. So how do you address these issues? So this is an area where we're focused with our colleagues. Now, in terms of some of the policy recommendations that emerge from our work in cooperation with others, including IOE, by the way, on the digitalization of the MSMEs. One is the raising awareness and capacity of entrepreneurs and MSME to take advantage of the business opportunities related to the SDGs and to transition towards decarbonized economies that leverage competitiveness attribute while increasing resilience, right? Put in place policies that allow reduction on taxes, administrative costs. So this cost of trading and of being in business for MSMEs and the starting costs for them is very important for a flourishing business environment. Encourage the link between education and research at universities and MSMEs and entrepreneurs with these accelerators and these others. And provide widespread business development services, including easily accessible online tools like the one that we and ILO and others and with UNITAR have been providing throughout the pandemic to assist MSME to go to the challenges of reorganizing their business, adopting new business model, and quickly respond to consumer needs changes. I also would like to point out to my colleague ITC, the International Trade Center, that have provided a 9-point action plan for building back better with women entrepreneurs. And many of those policy recommendations also apply in general to MSMEs. So you may want to go there. But since I don't have time to go in detail, in 15 seconds left, what I'd like to do is address the innovation policies. So, history has shown that difficult moments like these crises open the door for innovation. And while large companies are needed, the smaller business drive new idea. They're more able and nimble to shake up the economy and adapt to these new opportunities. It is therefore crucial that our policy are put in place to allow MSME to flourish in this environment. And I mentioned earlier the role of MSMEs that leverage digital technology during the crisis. I'll give you an example. We have an e-founders program where we've supported entrepreneurs in Africa. And from a survey that we did in 212 smart young digital entrepreneurs from 25 countries in Africa and Asia who participated in our program, basically created almost 30,000 direct jobs and generated almost $1 million in annual revenue. And we have another program, which is E-Trade for All, that we've adapted also for women. And it goes to what Patricia and Farid had mentioned as well. With E-Trade for All, E-Trade for Women, what we did is we know that women need to have a seat at the table and talk directly to policymakers because they have constraints that other entrepreneurs don't have. And so we basically focus on that linkages and having that voice of the women entrepreneurs to talk directly to policymakers. And all of what I just said can only be successful if we look at the infrastructure. There's an important role to be played to ensure proper infrastructure exists in terms of access to internet, but also the ability of our entrepreneurs to use these capacity and generate value out of data. And of course, to do that, they will need access to affordable, reliable electricity. You're muted, Tina.
Great, thank you. You think by now I would have learned. Thank you so much, Dr. Chanteline, for that. Very good with the timing and very impressive with the 30,000 direct jobs. That's like a real KPI. That's a real impact of a real, innovative policies that could really change lives. And very impressive also initiative on women entrepreneurs. And I think we really need to increase more awareness on that, on the challenges. We do need more women to sit at the table, because that's the only way that could, help. Diversity is really important when it comes to competitiveness of companies as well. Ms. Patricia, what are your views? I'm not doing very well on time. Unfortunately, we have 10 minutes left. Ms. Patricia, what are your views with regards to this enabling environment for businesses to thrive? From your experience, what are the key barriers which governments might not be aware about? Which policy interventions, in your view, can work to incentivize small business owners? And on the other side, which policies can work against expansion? So just looking at that, and just to kind of have a more controversial, key messages here on what would you say that would work, and what would you say has not worked? Could some outdated regulatory requirements be improved? And if so, which ones?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina. I'll just gonna try to be fast here, because I know we're having timing issues. And it was very interesting to hear what Chantal just said and what she mentioned about what was brought on the table, okay, for entrepreneurs in general. And I think that indeed, from a regulatory framework, I spoke about it earlier on, is that we need to sit on the table. I'm lucky enough to be part of an employers organization, to have a voice that is being heard, but we're not many of us. That is one thing. So I'm lucky enough to be there and to be part of all these institutions, organization, etc. Okay, so I think that is one thing that they need to do. And also, we've been talking about access to finance. Government speaks about it, but tell me, maybe somewhere, but here around, I haven't heard of the fact that they try to reduce taxes and so on, okay, for SMEs specifically, and I would, on top of that, say for women entrepreneur. That has not happened, but it is a reality. And for instance, let me just tell you something, because I'm sure that what we will start speaking about it at a later stage. But in the meantime, I've opened up a new company. You know me in education, but I've started a new company that's related to access to finance. I've actually started a private equity, and I've been around to search for funds and money to finance SMEs, because I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know what the needs are, you see? And because, well, my other companies are there, they're trying to make it, but it's actually so difficult that I say, okay, what is it? If they don't give it to us, then let's just create it, you see? And that is actually what I've done. I've actually created a company. I had to see the central bank and all the stuff. And I've had lots of meetings now with the financial institution, because I actually spoke about the IMF. And I said, the IMFs, they're very nice, but they do not address themselves to us. They always address themselves to us through banks, through whatever. And I said, you giving us money, but you're giving us money through a bank, but you're actually borrowing the bank money to borrow us. Think of interest rate. The interest rate here, the lowest, and that's because we know people, would be around 10 to 12%. That would be the lowest. How do you want us to do something? So that's exactly what I've started. So I've organized myself. I made sure I had a technical expert, because I am not a specific expert in finance, but even though I've trained myself for the past 3 months, I've been training myself into this to understand what I was doing, because I know what I want to reach. But once again, you see, this is typical when we speak about regulatory framework. We need to have things on the table. And I'm like, I wish more government would speak to Chantal or with Farid about these things, because it seems to be very isolated. It seems to be very marginal. You know, you hear about it in certain environment, but not really everywhere. And that is still a problem to us. You see, we need this. And that is what they don't do. And I like to believe that everybody is of goodwill. And what they do is that, well, they try to come up with some ideas. They try to, I'm just trying to be nice here, but you know, I think they try to come up with certain things, but it is not effective, because they also don't go to the right people. We go to the right institution. we're going to speak with the UNCTAD, with ECOSOC, with IOE, with ILO. But when I hear governments, they actually don't do it. I don't know if it's because they think they know it all, but that is also another problem, you know, convincing them of, okay, we know you are the big guy, you governments, we know you know, but please maybe have a different ear, maybe listen differently for it to bring results. And that is maybe what we kind of lacking at the moment, you know. And I'm part of lots of meetings and missions, and you just name it, you know. I'm gonna have a whole day of SADC tomorrow, SADC Business Council, but it's like only government is not really hearing or not really putting in practice. The private sector, I think, has done much better for the past 2 years than government in general. It hasn't been easy for government, I agree, but they've done more. And I'm going to come back to the social protection side, for instance, because it's also something that I work on at FEC. Okay, but when you hear what government says about in the country here, what they say about social protection, they want universal social protection. Wonderful. Like I said earlier, who pays for it? We pay for it. Makes no sense. The idea is great, but in practicality, it actually makes no sense. So yeah, but I think I'm gonna have to stop because I've reached my 5 minutes too. So.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much. And I really thank you for being courageous, because it's not something that's easy to say, but it has to be said. And I think policymakers need to be aware that in your case, you had no choice. You had to take things into your own hands, and you did not wait for governments to fill in the policy gaps, and you actually had to fill in the gaps yourselves, because no one is there to help you. So thank you very much for that, for being brave to come to the front and just to share the real challenges of what's happening right now. So because we do not have much time, we only have 4 minutes left. We did receive a few questions, so I will give each one of you 1 minute. I'm so sorry for that, to answer some of the questions that is being selected by my colleagues here. So Dr. Chantal, we receive a question here from one of the listeners, and they said that, how do we level the playing field for development countries versus developed countries? So I think this is in relation to your opening remarks and the projects that you have mentioned. And I will now go to Dr. Farid, and there's a question here asking about, okay, so SMEs are in need of major collaboration to pool resources, like you mentioned, access to finance. But how do you include those in remote areas that are not mainstream during the crisis? So that's an interesting question. Maybe you can share that from your field experience. And Patricia, we received also really good comments in the Zoom saying that they're really grateful that you shared the key barriers that you have experienced. So, and they're asking, in this case, they were asking, say, what kind of commitments from governments, you talked about the barriers there before, what kind of commitments for governments would really help business owners such as yourself? I mean, you mentioned access to finance, but what kind of commitment would really help you in real terms? So now going back to Dr. Chantaline, can you tell us in 1 minute your response to that question?
Sure, and I'll be brief because I want to hear Patricia's response. As I said, we you know, one thing that countries can do is stronger competition and antitrust policies. You know, we've let those go, and we might need to start revising those. And in this project we're doing in Latin America and the Caribbean, in selected countries, we're going to have lessons learned and specific concrete recommendation for MSMEs. Over.
Perfect. You did it so well. Thank you so much, Dr. Chantaline. Dr. Farid, over to you.
Yes, I actually answered this in writing already, but I can very quickly say through the regional arms of these employer organizations or sectorial chambers where they exist, you're right that often informal enterprises are not really captured, as they're not usually part of the formal communication channels. But to be inclusive, we have facilitated direct engagement with informal enterprises, for instance, through surveys. Maybe just 20 seconds on support that we are working on. We are providing a new guide based on research in Africa or for employer organizations on the changes that are likely to remain after the pandemic, relating to working conditions, to performance and productivity, to health and safety, to workplace relations, to skills development, to digital access. All this is going to be coming soon as a guide, so look forward to it. And over, so that we have time for Patricia.
Thank you, Dr. Farid. We will watch for that space. And Ms. Patricia, over to you.
Well, I would say one thing: reduce tax. Give us time without taxing. And from an employer point of view, I would even say reduce even taxes that you actually have on workers, because, you know, we can't pay them that much, but if we reduce a little bit of tax on revenues, okay, they might earn more without us having to pay more. You see, they would have more in their hands, so it feels like they have more money. Okay, government has a bit less, but then we are also creating. You see, like I say, I didn't stop because things were going wrong. I searched and I created something new, and that involves also people. So reduce taxes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you to all three panelists for your commitment and your time and the preparation to participate in this event. Is highly appreciated. I cannot help but be impressed with all the points you have raised. Access to finance, enabling business environment, a conducive regulatory framework to support SMEs, innovative policies, partnerships. They're all important. I have this feeling that this resonates with so many of us in the private sector and international organizations. So we hope listeners can take it with them, reflect on them, be open to trying something different in the policymaking process and at your discussions at the national level. And as for the listeners, thank you all for sparing your time. We hope we had made the best out of the 50 minutes we have together, and we all learned something new. I'm a strong believer that we are only stronger if we do positive things together, not just for business, but also for society as a whole. So I close the event now. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you again in the near future. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.